Evening, everyone, and welcome to this presentation by the League of Women Voters of Pueblo. I'm Ruth Nierenberg, and I'm the president. Tonight we have with us Dr. Matt Harris, who will be discussing critical race theory. We will be monitoring the chat, and we ask that if you have any questions that you put them in the chat, and at the end of his slide presentation, we will ask the questions and to him. So I think that's about it. And now I would like for Miss Diane Johnson to come on and introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Our community conversation this evening is, as Ruth said, about critical race theory, what it is and what it is not. Now, this is a fairly complicated topic, we understand, and we also have heard that it is being discussed in just about every school board out there in the country. And we've read about it in newspapers and magazines, and we see it being bandied about on social media. And yet many of us really don't feel greatly knowledgeable about what this important topic is, what it entails, what it's about. So with us tonight to help clear up some of our questions is Dr. Matthew Harris from Colorado State University, Pueblo. Dr. Harris is a professor of history and the director of the legal studies program at the university. He earned his PhD from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He writes and teaches on U.S. legal and constitutional history, race and religion, civil rights, church and state, and American religions. He has also written several books on these topics. And so, without further ado, to help us better understand critical race theory, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Matthew Harris from CSU Pueblo. The stage is yours, Matt.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you to Ruth and Diane and Sheila and others of the League of Women Voters for inviting me tonight. I thought, what topic could I choose that would not be controversial? And so I settled on critical race theory. So just kidding. It's probably one of the most controversial topics in American politics today. And perhaps after my presentation tonight, one might get a better sense of why that's so. So let me just speak to my background a little bit further, is that over the last 5 or 10 years or so, I've been thinking about matters of race, particularly African Americans. And I've been writing about civil rights and religion in my professional work. And so I've been thinking about these topics for a long time now. And my first exposure to critical race theory was when I was doing my doctoral training in New York. And part of my training took place in law school. And so critical race theory, as we'll learn tonight, is a theoretical concept that was advanced by legal scholars. And that was my first exposure to this theory a long time ago. All right, so what I want to do tonight is I want to give each of us a sense of what critical race theory is, what it isn't, and most importantly, talk about how this theory can be applied in practice. I think that's really where the rubber hits the road, is how does critical race theory look in everyday life? How does it look in scholarship? How does it affect us? Why is it controversial? I also want to talk about why people are up in arms, if you will, over this theory, why they're angry about it. And I want to suggest some possibilities for that. And then finally, I want to use as sort of a case study to critical race theory tonight, voting or voter suppression, which is appropriate given that this is the League of Women Voters. So without further ado, I'm going to just jump right in. And I want to start with a couple of cartoons tonight. This one says, first we outlaw critical race theory, then we burn books. And if this wasn't happening, it would be really laughable. But indeed, it is happening in the United States today. And it really reminds one of a bygone era, perhaps that we read about when we were kids, that older communities used to burn books and hide books and suppress books. But we're seeing this happen across the United States today, and it's obviously greatly concerning. This is, there are a number of books that are in harm's way, if you will, with school boards, but not surprisingly, over the last 2 years, some of these folks who want to suppress and burn books, they've turned their attention to critical race theorists. They've turned their attention to anyone who talks about anti-racism strategies. And the couple that come to mind the most is this one here by a race theorist and historian named Ibram Kendi. And when George Floyd was murdered a couple of years ago, my daughter, my wife and I, we read this book, we talked about it as a family, and it was really an illuminating book. And I would encourage, if you read one book about anti-racism, I would point you to Ibram Kendi's great book. The other book that I recommend all of these books, but this one here is an interesting book written by a graduate of West Point, a career military officer. Ty Sadol holds a PhD in American history, grew up in Virginia, idolizing Robert E. Lee. And the book is about his coming of age when he recognizes that Robert E. Lee was not the iconic figure that he had thought or learned growing up in Virginia. And Ty Sadul even goes as far as to say that the great Confederate general was guilty of treason. So it's an interesting coming of age book. And I just learned recently that this has been banned in some states. And it's an incredible book and an incredible read. So anyway, there's a larger conversation going on here, I would submit, about why we're banning books today. And that's really one of the things I want to get at. And then the last cartoon is, I found this, I couldn't resist, critical erase theory. If they can't teach it, it never happened. It's kind of like, a bill, that if you don't open your bill, you won't have to pay it. Well, that's obviously nonsense. 2 days ago in the Washington Post, there was an article that caught my attention, and there's been lots of articles, but this one was really an interesting article. It's titled, "New Critical Race Theory Laws Have Teachers Scared, Confused, and Self-Censoring." And you can see in the second paragraph here that 13 states have passed laws or directives that govern how race is to be taught in schools. And what's really, really interesting about this article is that these new laws are vague. They don't really specify about what you can and cannot teach. And so you read the rest of the article, and it has a chilling effect on teachers. That is, they're afraid to teach subjects that they once taught. One teacher said that, "I don't even want to teach about Jim Crow and civil rights." And I read that and I thought, oh my goodness, what world do we live in where we can't in a public school teach about Dr. King? But yet this teacher is fearful that somebody will report her for violating the statute that says that you can't cross a certain boundary in race. And there are other fears that's going on about what teachers used to teach and what they no longer feel comfortable to teach. So this is a huge problem right now in our public schools. And furthermore, I would argue that the people making these laws or rules are oftentimes not trained in history or race. And I like to think of it as one of us on this conversation tonight, where we go into the dentist office, and the first thing we say as we go in to have our tooth pulled is we start to instruct the dentist about how to pull our teeth. Now, that's silly because we're not dentists, and we wouldn't presume to know about how to pull a tooth over, the knowledge of the dentist. But yet this is something that we see happening here. Non-educators, people who aren't skilled in race training and race relations, they're dictating about how our teachers teach. And that's obviously deeply concerning. Critical race theory began in the 1970s. This gentleman on the left here, he's now deceased, but his name is Derek Bell. He taught law school, various law schools in the United States, most recently at Harvard Law before he died. And he's the one that really coined this idea of critical race. And the concept was expanded upon by this scholar here, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who is a professor of law at UCLA and also Columbia University. And she still teaches today. And so they're the two that really derive this topic. Well, what is it? Well, first of all, the core idea is that race is a social construct. You weren't born white, you weren't born brown, but your race is determined based on how laws govern what race you would be. So let me give you an example. In 1930, the US Census decided that they would classify anyone who was African American. They called it the one drop rule. If you had any ancestry going back to Africa at any point in your family tree, you would be deemed Black by the state. And what's interesting about that census law in 1930 is that states had their own views about how they constructed race. Some states would argue that if you had 1/4 African ancestry, you could be deemed Black. Some states argued if you had 1/32 African ancestry, you could be deemed Black. It's possible to be deemed Black in one state, cross a border, and be deemed white in another. And so the CRT looks at race as a construct, and it also looks at that racism is not merely the product of an individual bias or prejudice, and this is really, really critical to this conversation tonight, is that racism is embedded in legal systems and policies. Its assumption is that white supremacy is protected by law and government policies. So the focus, therefore, is not on individual behavior, but on institutions and how these institutions protect a certain class or race of people. And I want to say, I know this is sort of abstract at the moment, and I'm going to get into some details in a minute, and I think you're going to see how critical race theory works in practice and why it's so critical to understanding race in this country. A subset of critical race theory is what Kimberly Williams Crenshaw has called intersectionality, which means that if you want to understand a poor single mother or a gay Black man, that one must examine the dimensions, all of the dimensions of their life that may be appropriate, like class or gender or race or sexuality. In other words, we have to look at the full array of factors that define who a person is in all of their complexity. Also, critical race theory is predicated upon what we call white privilege. And if this were my class at CSU Pueblo, I would ask my students, how many of you have heard of white privilege? What do you think it is? What do you know about it? Let me give you a couple of examples about white privilege. One would be regarding me. I'm a white man. I get privilege as a white man if I go into a store. Unless I'm doing something stupid or suspicious or something that would lead one to think there's probable cause that I'm doing something wrong, I get privilege. I don't have to worry about a police officer following me in the store. I don't have to worry about a security officer interrogating me for no reason, all because of the color of my skin. But people of color, and we're focused on African Americans, which is my expertise and where my professional work takes me. But this applies to our brown brothers and sisters too, Hispanic Americans and others, other marginalized groups. The other second example I would give you is something I read in the Washington Post 3 years ago. It dealt with a Black couple who was at the grocery store, and they were holding a white baby, a little baby who was crying. And somebody had called the police on this couple because the assumption was that this couple had kidnapped this baby, and that's why the baby was crying. And when the police arrived, they cornered the couple in the grocery store, and they asked the father what's going on. And this Black man said, "This is our baby. We just adopted this baby, and this baby's teething. What's your problem, officer?" And I share that story with you because the assumption, of course, is that Black couples don't adopt white babies, and therefore there must be a problem. But if you flip it around and you assume or suppose that it was a white couple with a Black baby, that nobody would have called the police because statistically speaking, white people adopt Black babies at a higher rate than Black couples adopting white babies. So that's white privilege. That's white privilege. That's what it means to claim privilege. As I mentioned a minute ago, this is taught in third-year legal seminars in law schools across the United States. And it's important to say third-year legal seminars. If you go to a law school and you take critical legal theory, it's an elective course. Most law students who graduate from law schools in the United States do not have any training in CRT. It's not part of their professional work. And so it's remiss to think that every law student is familiar with CRT. In fact, I'd go one further. If you take Pueblo, for example, and you were to, I'm making this up as a sort of a thought experiment, but if you were to talk to lawyers in Pueblo and ask them if they have any training in CRT, I would wager a bet that 90% of them have not. Because most lawyers are concerned about passing the bar exam and they want to take courses that will help them pass the bar exam, whether it's torts or whether it's tax or whatever. And critical race theory, of course, is not on the bar exam. All right, so a visual to look at critical race theory, it's focused on institutions and not individual behavior. And critical race theorists would look at these two images here, and they would say, is racism the individual product of, say, one bad apple in the barrel, in which case you can work with the one bad apple or remove it or throw it away or whatever you want to say about it? Or is racism so deeply embedded into the institutions that create a barrel of bad apples? And so obviously they're focused on the image on the right, which is the barrel that produces the apples, as opposed to the one isolated apple that may not be bearing good fruit. All right, so a couple of misconceptions before we dive into some theory or some application. The first misconception is that CRT is an individual racial prejudice. It's just a teacher teaching something about racism. Well, that's not CRT. Remember, CRT studies institutions to address racial inequities in law. And that's how it started out first in the 1980s. It started out by looking at inequities in the law and also government. But over time, it's applied to now education and sports and media. And so it's sort of broadened over the last 30 or 40 years. The biggest misconception that we learn on TV today, or at least some facets of TV, is that it's taught everywhere in public schools. And that is just so demonstrably false, to think that a fourth grader is learning critical race theory, when, as I mentioned, it's a sophisticated legal theory that only a small subset of law students are learning. And so there's a handful of undergraduate programs in this country at colleges and universities that would expose their students to the tools of critical race theory, much like they would communism or fascism. And they're taught in anthropology classes, principally history classes, political science classes, but overwhelmingly, colleges and universities do not teach critical race theory. And there's a number of reasons why. So anyway, it's mostly taught in law schools with some rare exceptions. The last point is that CRT teaches that white people are evil and inherently racist. And this is a tough one to swallow. It doesn't do that, but it does examine how white people benefit from laws and policies because of their race. Now you can see why this would be controversial to some Americans who might not understand the legal underpinnings of critical race theory, is because they feel threatened if folks are studying how laws benefit one race over that of another. So common questions that critical race theorists ask is, what is the significance of race in contemporary American society? How does it structure our relationships at work? How does it structure our relationships at school, or perhaps in our communities? Where and in what ways and to what ends does race appear in dominant American culture and shape the ways that we interact with one another? What types of texts and other cultural artifacts reflect dominant cultural perceptions of race? How can scholars convey that racism is a concern that affects all members of society? How does racism continue to function as a persistent force in American society? How can we combat racism to ensure that all members of American society experience equal representation and access to fundamental rights? And finally, how can we accurately reflect the experiences of victims of racism? What's deeply disturbing about that Washington Post article that I referenced a minute ago is that if teachers cannot teach about racism, then it's hard to really pursue answers to these incredibly important questions. Now, before I introduce the concepts of critical race, how it's applied, I want to share with you some books that you may have come across at Barnes & Noble, or perhaps you've seen them if you read the New York Times review of books every Sunday morning. But there have been some New York Times best-selling books that deal with critical race theory. They don't put it on the title. In fact, many of them don't even acknowledge that they're using the tools of critical race theory as they explore their topics. But In this slide, you can see to the left, there's a book called The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Gap. So Mirza Bogdaran looks at how there's a wealth gap between white and Black people as a result of certain bank policies. I'll say more about that in just a minute. The second book is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This is a book that I have my students in my civil rights class read. If you are interested in, whenever you hear criminal justice reform, and we hear it in the news a lot among politicians, this is the book to read. And it's well written, the argument is easy to digest. And I would say, let me say this parenthetically about this book. I had a student who is the son of an evangelical preacher. He just graduated from CSUP Pueblo last year, and he had me in 4 classes, I think, self-identified as a conservative. And the last class that he took at CSU Pueblo was my civil rights class. And he came to me and he said, Professor Harris, and he's holding the book and he said, this is the most powerful book I've ever read in my 4 years of college. And it has completely reoriented the way that I see race. And of course, I'm happy because this book had this impact on him. And that's, of course, the impact that I hope it would achieve. The next one is by Dorothy Brown. These are all legal scholars, by the way. Dorothy Brown wrote a book recently that was published called The Whiteness of Wealth. And she looks at something as innocuous as the tax code. How is it that the IRS has created a system of policies that punish Black Americans and favor other Americans? It's an extraordinary book. And then the book to the far right is called The Color of Law, that deals with policies in various communities that allow for segregation, allow for redlining. And then the last slide with books I'll share with you, the two on the ends, the left and the right, deal with the Supreme Court and how the courts have been complicit in creating an unequal application of the law. And then in the middle is a book that studies the American medical system and how there are racial and ethnic disparities in how healthcare is meted out in this country. And certainly with COVID, we've seen that in communities of color a lot, that some of these communities of color are at higher risk for infection, higher risk for mortality, and so forth. All right, so what are the questions? Well, this is really where the rubber hits the road, if I can use that well-used cliche. The criminal justice system, and this is Michelle Alexander's outstanding book, she asks a simple question. How is it that 80% of young African Americans have criminal records compared to like 5% of white Americans? Why is it that 1/3 of young African American men serve prison time? And the short answer is because Black men are easy targets. You can arrest them for minor drug infractions, you can imprison them, and then essentially disenfranchise them because they get out of prison, they've served time for a felony, and they can no longer vote in most states. They don't have access to food stamps. Nobody will hire them because they have a felony on their record. It's an easy way to sort of create a new wave of Jim Crow in the 21st century. And lest you think that this is a partisan comment, Michelle Alexander talks about both Republican and Democratic presidents who have used, or in this case, abused the criminal justice system by targeting African Americans. And if anybody's keeping score at home, President Biden has apologized for his role that he advanced 30 or 40 years ago when he was in the US Senate, talking about, we've got to make our drug laws more difficult. We've got to tighten them up. And of course, that's always code speak for targeting young Black men in communities of color. The next one is the IRS. Why does the American tax law favor white people? Well, the author went through and looked at Black and Hispanic workers and said that they are less likely to have access to tax affordable benefits like capital gains, 401ks, or 529 savings plans for college. A lot of these tax laws, the author points out, were put in place 60, 70 years ago before this country was desegregated. The next one is banking laws. Why is there a wealth gap that benefits white people? Well, these are just snapshots of these arguments. I just want to reiterate that. I don't want you to get the impression that you're getting a full iteration of these arguments in a short little presentation tonight, but I'm giving you some highlights, I hope. But the wealth gap is a result of, among other things, African Americans paying a higher interest rate through payday loans, as opposed to going to and securing lower interest loans like white people. And also Blacks are redlined, and Hispanic communities are also redlined, in which there are lines drawn in communities in which banks and businesses will not invest, both because of racial prejudice and also because some of these communities are impoverished. And then the Supreme Court is part of this study. And the big question that some critical race theorists who study the courts have asked in recent years is, how have the courts since 1970 retreated from racial justice? And I think most of us might recall taking history classes either in high school or in college, in which we learned about Brown versus the Board of Education at Topeka, Kansas. This is the historic Supreme Court case that desegregated public schools. And in the 1950s and 60s, under the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a guy named Earl Warren, the Supreme Court was very liberal when it came to racial issues and supporting civil rights and cracking down on institutions and states that didn't support racial equality. Well, since in the last 50 years, we've seen a retreat from the court's progressive views, even as recently as 2013 in a court case that you can see up here called Shelby v. Holder. And we're hearing about this case in the law or in the news today. And what it does is that it guts the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now that's a vague comment, it guts the Voting Rights Act. Well, what does that mean? The Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the provisions of it, said that states that have a long history of racial oppression, so that's the way that statute reads, states that have a long history of racial oppression, in this case, southern states, that whenever they want to gerrymander their states for voting purposes, they need to get clearance first from the Department of Justice. And in 2013, the Supreme Court said that is no longer the case. And I'm going to share with you when we get to voting rights in just a minute about the results of the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act, how it's contributed to some racial inequities today. Next is segregation. I think most of us are probably familiar with segregation. There are two kinds of segregation. There's de jure segregation, which means segregation by law. And there's also de facto segregation, which means segregation by circumstance. And clearly in the 21st century, de jure segregation is not constitutional, but we still have segregation. One just has to go to an American city where you see clusters of racialized groups in one part of the community and others across town. Well, that's not de jure segregation. It's not because Black folk live across the railroad tracks or Hispanics live across the railroad tracks because of law. It's because of circumstance. But the result is all the same, whether it's by law or circumstance, there's still segregation. And so in educational funding, critical race theorists look at how these schools compare to, say, that of white schools. And then I'm going to jump down to sports real quick. We've learned in the news now that there's a lawsuit from an NFL football coach. He's suing because he's arguing that he was lied to, that NFL teams were interviewing him just because he was Black, but they had no intention in hiring him. And the NFL has a huge problem with these racial disparities because the league is overwhelmingly made up of Black athletes, but yet there's only one Black coach. So institutionally, that is a huge problem. I want to turn to voting rights now for a moment for our discussion and apply some of the CRT theories there, or questions. And one of the main questions about voting rights in recent years is that we hear things like race neutral laws. How can people be angry if the government wants us to have a driver's license? After all, everybody has to have a driver's license to vote. It doesn't say just Black people. But yet that sounds innocent until you get into some of the data. And also until you start to dig and figure out who's passing these laws and why they're passing them. That's really critical. And there are two things that govern the voting apparatus in this country. The first one is passed just after the American Civil War. This is the 14th Amendment. And it's probably the most important amendment in the US Constitution, other than maybe the First Amendment, which deals with the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, assembly, and so forth. Well, the 14th Amendment says that the government or the state cannot deny a person their life, their liberty, or their property without due process of law. It's just a simple way of saying that the government can't take your land from you unless there's reason to take your land and it's been adjudicated in court. They can't take your life from you unless it's been adjudicated in court. But it also says that they cannot deny you, any person within its jurisdiction, the equal protection of the laws. It's the only time in the US Constitution where the word equality is mentioned. Sometimes people will say, you know, Professor Harris, what about the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's true. The Declaration says that all men are created equal, but that's not a constitution. It has no, it's not binding legally. It's just it's a philosophical document to justify separation from Great Britain. So here we have equal protection of the laws for the first time in constitutional legal history, and it applies to African Americans who had just been freed from the Civil War. But over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century, we've broadened this application of the Equal Protection Clause to apply to other minorities, not just African Americans, but persons who are disabled, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. So there's a whole number of folks who fall under this equal protection. And it simply says that if one group of people enjoy privileges, legal privileges, then other groups should also enjoy those privileges. And you can see how it applies to voting. The courts are always trying to understand voting, especially suppression tactics, vis-a-vis the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Then the last one is, I referenced it a minute ago, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it said that you cannot deny anyone, the state cannot deny someone the right to vote based on account of their race or skin color. And so, and that in 1965, it was really applying to poll taxes and literacy tests, that you can no longer apply those to as a benchmark to vote. All right, so let's talk about race neutral laws that we hear about in the news quite a bit. And the person who frankly has influenced my thinking the most on this is this woman here. She's a professor of history and African American studies at Emory University in Atlanta. She wrote a wonderful book called One Person, No Vote. And she talks about poll taxes. And in 1950, she said that the median income for African Americans was 54% to that of whites. And which of course occupied a disproportionate share of an African American's disposable income. So on the one hand, it's true that poll taxes applied to everybody, but on the other hand, it penalized Black people more since they had a smaller disposable income. And the second issue with these poll taxes, as Professor Anderson points out, is that state or voting is a local issue. And it still is today, by and large. But it was a local issue, and it has been for a long time. The Constitution allocates voting to states, and the federal government gets involved from time to time, but historically it's been a state issue. Well, in the 1950s and 60s, if you were being denied the right to vote, you would go to the local sheriff to address your grievances. The problem is, though, is that the local sheriff was often a part of the Ku Klux Klan. So if you're an African American and you feel like that you're not being able to vote, you're being pestered at the voting booth, you're certainly not going to find a sympathetic audience in the person who has a sheriff's outfit on, but underneath he's got white robes. That's just not going to work in your favor. Also, it's one of the reasons why the government passed in 1957 one of the first civil rights acts. And what the first Civil Rights Act of 1957 does is that it brings the federal government into elections. And the reason why it brings the federal government, i.e. the FBI, into elections is because of this idea that there was discrimination by local law enforcement when it came to enforcing one's right to vote. Now, the voter ID laws, this is really interesting. When I'm in class at CSU Pueblo, I typically will take out my wallet, I'll show them my driver's license, and I'll say something like, why is this controversial to require this ID, the right to vote? Everybody has to do it. What's the big deal? And it sounds innocuous enough. Why does it matter? We have a driver's license. We have to show that we are who we are. And my students, they talk for a moment and I'm not really quite sure where I'm going with this. They don't know how to answer it typically. But what's interesting is the questions that critical race theorists would ask, which is, one of them would be, why does it have to be a driver's license to show some form of valid ID? Why can't it be your utilities bill? Why can't it be your social security card? Why can't it be some other form of government IDs that other government agencies require? Why does it have to be a driver's license? Well, that's the rub. It has to be a driver's license. And what Carol Anderson and other scholars have uncovered, she looks at her community in Georgia, and she argues or demonstrates that 18% of African Americans in and around Atlanta, where she lives, don't have access to a vehicle, as compared to only 5% or 4% of white Atlanteans. And she says that of the state's 56 Department of Motor Vehicles throughout the state, only 5 are accessible by public transit, which is to say that in Atlanta, this inner city, if you don't have access to public transit, it's going to be very, very hard to get to the DMV. If you don't own a car, it's going to be hard to vote. Since when is voting predicated upon owning a car? And so, well, obviously it's not, but it's a way to disenfranchise a group of people knowing that they don't own cars to the rate of, say, other groups in Atlanta. I should also say one other thing about this, that when Atlanta passed their voter ID laws about 10 years ago, they closed down a number of DMVs in Black communities for no apparent reason. So I'll let you draw the appropriate conclusion about how they're implementing these voter suppression tactics. I mentioned a minute ago about Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court case in 2013. And what we're seeing today in the news is the Supreme Court upholding racial gerrymandering. In 2022, so as we speak, there are 27% of African Americans in Alabama. But yet of their 7 congressional seats, they only have 1 representative. Now, if you believe in equal justice under the law, which is what the 14th Amendment states, which is the symbol that's emblazoned on top of the US Supreme Court building in Washington, DC, if you believe in that, then one would argue that African Americans, based on the fact that they're almost 30% of the population, they ought to have more than 1 congressional seat. But yet the lawmakers in Alabama have diced up these Black communities so as to dilute their voice. They cannot choose a representative that shares their values because of this racial gerrymandering that the court has said is okay. Now, this never would have happened had not the court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, because they would have had to have gotten pre-clearance to do this from the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice wouldn't have signed off on this. So these are just, there's a bunch of other reasons that we can look at. All of these things, especially the voter ID laws that we're seeing more and more now, it's predicated upon one thing and one thing only. It's predicated upon voter fraud. And political scientists and historians and legal scholars have been studying voter fraud for a very, very long time. And each of these studies have argued that voter fraud is statistically negligible in this country. It does not happen. And as I was putting my presentation together tonight for you, I was interested in not going to a liberal think tank like the Brennan Center for Justice that I quote here, but I wanted to find a conservative think tank. And one of the most reputable conservative think tanks is called the Heritage Foundation. And they had just concluded a study recently in which they looked at 250 million ballots cast over a 20-year period from 2000 to 2020. And of the 215 million ballots cast, they found 193 criminal convictions, civil penalties, diversions, or other official findings for fraudulent use. When MIT elections scholar Charles Stewart read the findings of this report, he crunched the numbers. And he said that mail-in ballots resulted, because of the Heritage Foundation study, that mail-in ballots resulted in criminal convictions at 0.0006%, and in-person ballots, criminal convictions at 0.007%. That is not a statistically significant number to overturn or affect any kind of election. Sometimes I'm sure, like you, We know people in our communities who tell us the election was stolen and all of this stuff. And, there's a couple of easy ways to deal with that sort of thing. Number one is, if you believe in the rule of law, we have a mechanism to adjudicate these kinds of things. And you simply ask, what do you make of the fact that over 70 lawsuits, both at the federal and state levels, both with Democratic and Republican judges, they have thrown all of these cases out because there is no evidence. There's also, you can go on, a news channel and you can lie until you're blue in the face, but you cannot do that in court. And that's what we're seeing in court. Former President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, got himself into some hot water 2 months ago in court, in which the judge said, where is the evidence that there's voter fraud? And Rudy Giuliani, who was a career prosecutor at one point, he should know better. He said, I saw it on the internet. Really? You saw something on the internet that suggests there's fraud? And being committed to the rule of law, the judge said, well, do you know who this person is? Well, no. So did you interrogate them? Well, no. So you're coming into my courtroom with evidence that you saw something on a YouTube of somebody doing something shady, and you want the court to take this kind of reasoning seriously. And obviously, you just don't waste the court's time like that. And this is why Mr. Giuliani is under hot water and will be ultimately debarred for stunts like this. But anyway, the Brennan Center for Justice concludes that it's more than likely for an American to be struck by lightning than to commit voter fraud, either through in-person voting or with mail-in ballots. Let me say a couple of thoughts. Our state has a long and distinguished history of mail-in ballots, and we've had strong voter integrity for a long time in our state. And sometimes folks will say, well, that's just a blue state. Colorado's turned a blue state. Well, then you can remind them that another state that's very proud of their mail-in ballots because of their missionary program and their citizens who are in the military is the state of Utah, which is decisively not a blue state. It's a red state. And they brag about their mail-in ballots as well. So it's not really a blue state, red state sort of thing. Both red and blue states have success with these mail-in ballots. The real hub is captured in this little message at the bottom of the slide about a former Republican legislative staffer in Wisconsin named Steve Bass. And I should tell you that this is an email that he wrote to his friend that was released under subpoena when he was making up voter fraud and all of this stuff. Bass said, quote, do we need to start messaging widespread reports of election fraud so that we are positively set up for the recount regardless of the final number? And then his friend, the Republican Assembly Speaker Scott Jensen, replied, yes, anything fishy should be highlighted. Stories of voter fraud should be solicited by talk radio hosts. And what's instructive about this is that if you really, really think there's voter fraud going on, you don't share it with a talk radio host. You would bring it to the FBI, whose purview it is to investigate such enterprises. All right, so we've got a few more minutes and I'm going to go through this part kind of quickly. This is a visual. When we talk about American racism, I think a lot of people, maybe in our own lives that we know, if we were to ask them, do you consider yourself a racist? They'd probably say no. And they might say, I don't use the N-word. I don't use racial slurs or tell racial jokes. I'm not a member of the Ku Klux Klan, nor am I a neo-Nazi. But racism is more subtle. That is, it's under the surface, some of the things that we cannot see. And it could be something as simple as if you're a teacher maybe, and you're assigning a curriculum that is heavily dominant on, say, a Eurocentric narrative. Or it could be something as simple as one of our well-intentioned friends or coworkers or perhaps even family members who, when they hear about Black Lives Matter, their retort is, all lives matter. And for me personally, that is really, really problematic to hear that, because on the one hand, of course, all lives matter. Of course. I don't know of any Black activist that I know and that I've read about and studied who would say otherwise. But when you say all lives matter, what you're really saying in effect is that you are not seeing the hardship that African Americans have been experiencing over the past couple of 3 years with law enforcement. It's a profound lack of caring, lack of empathy about what's been happening to them. And as I say very seriously to some of these folks, I'll say it's not white people who are getting in trouble with law enforcement or are getting harmed by law enforcement. It's Black people. So Black lives matter. And I hope that everybody within earshot tonight of my voice can reconsider if we say all lives matter when we hear about Black lives matter. Because indeed, as we've all heard, all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. All right. Now, why do some people, mostly conservatives, oppose critical race theory? And I want to focus on a couple of things here. One is, I think that they don't fully understand what it is. I don't think I've ever heard of one person on the news who can articulate that critical race theory is a set of tools that looks at institutional racism. I haven't heard that from anybody. But anyway, a couple of thoughts. One is that they believe that it contradicts the Bible, especially our evangelical brothers and sisters. They believe that it's Marxist in orientation. That is, that it's the antithesis of capitalism. I would argue that number 3 and 4 are the reasons that don't get enough attention. And the third one is the fear of the browning of America, that this country is, more immigrants have been coming into this country over the last 20 to 30 years. Our racial demographics are changing substantially. I'll show you a map of that in just a moment. And then finally, there is a big push over the last 30 years to decenter a European influence in American education. And I want to talk about both of those principles for a few minutes. You can see in the graph here that in 2019, the American census put white folk at 60% and Hispanic folk at 18.5% and Black folk at 12.2 and Asian at 5.6. And demographers predict in, I can't remember, 40 or 50 years that there will be more brown folk in this country than white folk. And I think to some people who aren't used to living in diversified communities, this is troubling to them. They don't accept it. They don't want it to happen. And in some cases, when they look at immigrants coming into this country, they have what we call otherized them. They've made them into something they're not. You can call them a druggist, a rapist, a murderer, a criminal, or whatever. And if you dehumanize them that way, then you can do bad things to them because they're not indeed human. But in reality, what we see from most immigrants coming into this country, they're law-abiding citizens, and they want the same things that most Americans want. They want food security. They want housing security. They want a good education for their children. They want to work and pay taxes and just live their lives. But in some cases, it's hard for some Americans to conceptualize immigrants in that way. Really what this is all about is a much larger conversation that's been happening in this country since the 1980s in earnest. And we're engaged in what we call culture wars. And culture wars, I would define as just simply, it's a clash of secular or non-religious values versus folks who hold religious values. And I heard during my life growing up, I heard that the founding fathers wanted us to be a Christian nation and the Constitution protects Christianity. And this is the sort of rhetoric that I heard growing up. And as I became a professional historian, decided to look into that topic. And so I did a book with a scholar at Baylor University named Thomas Kidd. And in this book to the right called The Founding Fathers and the Debate Over Religion in Revolutionary America, we look at the diverse voices of religion at the founding and views that various founders had. Some were extremely religious, some were not. And the argument we make is religion was just as contested in the 18th century as it is today. But yet we have a very particular point that some folks would want us to teach about the founding, despite it being messy and complex. Well, the culture wars ask a lot of questions, but I just highlighted a few. One would be, should intelligent design be taught in public schools along with evolution? And intelligent design, of course, is a theory that's advanced in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, in which there's an intelligent designer behind God's creation. And the Supreme Court has argued that they can't teach intelligent design in schools because it's not a science. You can't replicate the book of Genesis. Number two, do the founding fathers deserve more space in the curriculum than marginalized voices like African Americans, Hispanics, and indigenous communities? Number three, should teachers teach about racism in US history? And if so, how? Should students be allowed to pray in school? Do we teach the US was founded as a Christian nation or a secular one? And then for our purposes tonight, should we teach CRT in schools? These are all depending on where you sit in this culture war, whether you have secular values or religious values, you might have different answers to these questions. I don't want to turn this into a conversation that you've got secularists and religious folks. There are a lot of really committed Christians and Muslims and Jews who do not think that you should be praying in school, or so they don't, these categories don't align nicely between liberal and progressive or liberal and conservative. This idea of decentering American history, this is where school boards are really, really up in arms, in my opinion, is that most of these school board members, they grew up at a time when there were European centric models of education, where if you were to take a history class, you would get more founding fathers than anything else. Or if you were to take an American literature or world literature class, you might read a preponderance of plays or works from William Shakespeare. And in recent years, critical race theorists and others have been asking, you know, ought we not to expand our curriculum so that we can bring in more diverse and minority voices? I had a young woman, an African-American student, ask me last week in class. She said, Professor Harris, I'm going to be a teacher one day, and I'm really, really disturbed that we don't teach enough Black history in public schools. She said, how can I do that? How can I have some kind of a connection to American history through, as she put it, my people, African-Americans? And I told her, I said, you've got two options. One, you can change the curriculum, although that's going to be really hard to do. Or two, you can be clever. And she said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, if you teach the Civil War, let's say you're teaching fourth graders and you're teaching the Civil War. There's a unit on the Civil War. Talk about Black soldiers. That's within the framework of the curriculum. You won't get in trouble for that. When you talk about the New Deal and how it affects people during the Great Depression in the 1930s, look at how it affects African Americans. So there are ways to do that. If you were, if this were a Hispanic teacher, I would say the same thing. Look at how it affects Hispanic folk, these policies. So anyway, there's this big effort. And then more recently, I'm certain that some of you on this call tonight have heard of this controversial book that, or project as it's called, by Nicole Hannah-Jones. She was a New York Times writer. Now she's a professor of journalism at Howard University. But she really, really rattled the segments of the political world when she advanced this idea that American history has been too centered on 1776. She argued that if you really, really want to get into what defines the country the way that it's defined today, you have to go back to 1619 when the first slaves had arrived in Virginia. And so 1619 for this project is a pivotal year because she argues, and others who support her position, they argue that slavery is really the defining factor in American history. And it's obviously a controversial thing. There are some school districts that started to revise their curriculum around the concepts taught in the 1619 project. One of the last things that former President Trump did before he left office was that he had issued a report called the 1776 report, in which he had compiled or assembled some scholars to push back on this 1619 project. And literally one of the last things he did in January of 2021 is he signed an executive order threatening to defund any schools that teach the 1619 project. And consequently, a lot of schools that either taught it or at least referenced it, of course, they backtracked and they took it off their web pages and out of their curriculums. And one of the first things that President Biden did when he was sworn into office was to rescind Donald Trump's executive order. So it's no longer operational, but it speaks, and it's an interesting commentary about how we view our past. I want to say one thing about the 1776 report, how we politicize our past. There wasn't one American historian on this committee, which is deeply problematic if you're purporting to be an expert on American history. Not one American historian. And then a couple of last slides, and I'm going to end and we'll open it up to questions. That you can see on the left here that this is Nicole Hannah-Jones, the primary author of the 1619 project. And she was in the news not long ago because she was denied tenure at the University of North Carolina. They brought her they offered her a job, but they said, you can come here, but we're not going to give you tenure. And of course, she was offended because everybody else who held this distinguished chair came in with tenure, but they didn't tenure her, or they didn't want to. And it turned out there were some wealthy donors who didn't like what she was doing with the 1619 project, and so they pushed back at the university. And when it broke that these wealthy donors were opposed to her tenure, of course, a lot of Americans were angry about this, and the university backed down and offered her tenure. But by that point, she was so humiliated, she decided that she would join her good friend, another important African-American voice, Ta-Nehisi Coates, joined him at Howard University, one of the nation's preeminent Black universities. That's where she is today. All right, in conclusion, where do we go from here? Well, just a couple of summary thoughts is that we have to protect our democracy. There is no doubt about it. There's voter suppression going on as we speak. I'm not gonna, I wish I had better news, but it's happening before our very eyes. I just talked about voter ID laws tonight. There are a lot of ways that this is going on. And the best way to do this is to vote for candidates that reflect your values. Also, serving on school boards. We've seen in the news how school boards have become so politicized to the point where they're dictating, they're burning books and telling teachers what they can and can't teach, and even though they have no expertise. So serve on school boards and make our voices heard. Also, just simply engaging with friends and neighbors about racial inequities and structural racism, and trying to hopefully correct their misperceptions about what critical race theory is or what it isn't. Maybe rather than being overwhelmed with picking a cause to champion, maybe just pick one. Maybe it's something about looking at education and being involved that way, or voting and informing others about tactics that suppress one's right to vote. When it's all said and done, I think all of us, to quote the late great Maya Angelou, that when we've learned something and when we educate ourselves on something, then we do the best we can until we know better. And then when we know better, hopefully we can do better. And with that, I'm going to close my remarks and open it up to Q&A.
Well, one question that appeared, and I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but it's from Lanny, and maybe she can unmute if she's still here. The question, and she says, questions that CRT theorists ask. Who is the author of the book from which this info was asked? And she posted this during a slide that was earlier on. Are you there, Lanny? Can you?
Yes, the slide was titled Questions That Critical Race Theorists Ask.
Oh, yeah, all of those questions.
And you had mentioned the author of a book.
Actually, so the questions that critical theorists asks, those are questions from all of the books I showed you in the previous slide that I highlighted.
Oh, okay.
So the one on the IRS came from the book that deals with the IRS. The one on criminal justice was the new Jim Crow.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, there is another question about voter ID and driver's license or state issued ID. And are state issued IDs difficult to get, and or what would you suggest as far as the kind of identification that is obtainable more easily? In other words, can you help us out with that? And this question came from Mary Lynn.
Yeah, so I think it's important to know that this is not anything new. There are lots of identifications that the government recognizes. But yet with voter suppression, what we're seeing is a particular kind of identification. So I think that's really an important point. So the government has a long history of recognizing all kinds of identifications, particularly recognizing that not everyone owns a car or has a driver's license. So I would simply say that if you lived in public housing, you have ID that suggests that you live in public housing. that's valid. If you have a social security card, that's valid ID. If you have a bank statement verifying your address, that's a valid ID or form of identification. So these are all identifications that various governments in the United States have used, but yet we're not seeing that wide latitude with voting.
Okay, and one of the comments that followed that question was that in order to get even a state ID, you have to get to the office, and you made mention of transportation becoming more difficult under the voter suppression ideas.
Correct. Yeah, it's I think with these race neutral laws, I mean, it's pretty clear when you look at Atlanta, and 18% of African Americans don't have cars and 4% of white people don't. I mean, there's something going on there, right? I mean, this is not by happenstance. In Georgia, there was a law that was proposed. I don't think it passed, or maybe it's still being debated. I'm not sure. But the law was proposed that if on Sundays that you couldn't go to church and then bring your congregants over to drop off your mail-in ballots after church. That was a law in Georgia, or at least that was a proposed law in Georgia. On the face of it, once again, it seems like it's neutral, that it applies to everybody in Georgia until you recognize that the vast majority of the African-American community in Georgia, they will go and drop off their ballots after church. And they do that, they carpool, and they do that, of course, because of some folks who don't own cars. And so obviously the law, if African Americans didn't do that, this law would not have been an issue. And so anyway.
And there are just a lot of folks that don't understand that, and thus can see it as you say, neutral, a neutral law.
I think that the important question to ask would be, of anything with a law, is why is it passed and what is it intended to fix? There's always a context for something, right? So why do we have all of, a litany of voting laws that have popped up over the last 5 years? Well, the presumption is there's voter fraud when there's not, but yet you can use that as a pretext to suppress people, their vote. And oftentimes this isn't just African Americans you're talking about. We're dealing with Hispanic Americans as well.
We have another question that states, it disturbs me that CRT is being segregated into a small corner of law schools. I'm less concerned about its absence in K-12, where it isn't, than its absence in places like the Maxwell School. Could you comment on this, please?
I'm not sure the gist of the question. So do you want to rephrase it?
Is the person who contributed this question still available and could explicate it a little? Okay, I think what they're probably saying is that in the overall picture of things, when we talk about CRT being a small segment in law schools, and isn't actively being pursued in the more general population, could you comment on this? And I'm not sure how further to explain that. I guess what they're supporting is that this would be pursued in the elementary schools and among school children, rather than, and hopefully in a professional, reasonable way, which I'm sure there could be some question of, that the people who really understand CRT are a small group of people in law schools, as opposed to this being a more widespread, acceptable thinking.
I think, the question is, maybe in the spirit of this question, would be at what point should we teach CRT, if at all, in public schools?
Probably.
And CRT really gets into the nitty gritty about, we've talked about this bank law and healthcare law and these institutional disparities. I don't think the fourth grade is the appropriate, this is my opinion, of course, the appropriate venue to talk about institutional disparities. I mean, there's a hierarchy that one needs to learn in the 4th grade. I would start with just good old fashioned individual racism, you know, whether we're talking about Dr. King or Cesar Chavez or whatever, right? Certainly as students advance into their high school years, they need to learn not only individual or personal racism, but also institutional racism and how racism is embedded in some of our laws. And I think that high school kids can understand this, they can accept it. And then in college, we need to do a better job talking about CRT principles in college, whether it's history or anthropology or whatever class it is and whatever venue is appropriate. But these are, the presumption, of course, is you can't fix these inequities unless you're aware of them. And, you know, by banning CRT from schools, it's laughable because it's not taught in schools. It's just sort of an elusive ghost that some politicians want us to be angry about, but it's not taught in schools. And the fact of the matter is they don't even realize that. But it ought to be taught in schools, in my opinion, at appropriate grade levels. And I'm going to criticize my profession. I mean, we need to do a better job teaching it at the university and not just a small subset of 3rd-year legal seminars.
I think that's kind of exactly what this questioner was getting at. And there is another one, first of all, says, what an excellent presentation, and thanks you for that. And asks if these slides are available to those of us attending tonight's event. I know this is being recorded, I understand, but would your slides be available to somehow be able to be made available, some of them, to pursue a deeper interest in this ourselves?
Only if this person provided peanut butter cookies.
Ah, that sounds like
can
a
be
good
bribed.
answer. They can take it and do what they would like to with it.
I would
Thank you.
be
Okay, let's see what else we've got.
I would be happy to share my slides. So the issue is, I'm not sure, we'll figure it out. I can get them to you, Diane, or to Sheila or to somebody. I'd be happy to share these.
Really?
I believe this is also being live streamed on Facebook. So a person could watch it on the League of Women Voters of Pueblo's Facebook page.
I think that's great, Ruth. If I'd be happy to give my consent to share
There's
this.
There's also a comment from Lynette Jones that I think people need to hear. May I take that, Diane?
Oh, you bet.
Lynette Jones says, I experienced a great difficulty when I moved to Colorado 9 years ago with my elderly mother. She was 90 years old and had the paperwork required in order to get her state ID. It was very difficult to obtain. She had to get her birth certificate from South Carolina, and they didn't have good records going back 90 years. Colorado rejected the birth certificate they provided and required my mother to get a long form birth certificate in order to get her Colorado state ID. Even though she had plenty of identification, including her past driver's licenses and state ID from Pennsylvania and California. Very frustrating for both she and I to have to go through so many hoops, and made my elderly mother feel very hurt in the process. So.
Yeah, that's tough. You know, since you mentioned somebody who's older, one of the issues that we've run up against with voter suppression is purging techniques. A number of states use purging techniques, which means that if you haven't voted in, say, 3 years, then you automatically get purged from the rolls. And why this is problematic, of course, is if you were older and let's say that you were sick for 3 years and you couldn't vote, and all of a sudden you're well enough to go vote, and you think you're good to go because you've been voting at that residency for 60 years, you go to vote and you've been told that you're not on the rolls and you can't vote. And, you know, this happens a lot, particularly in states with high minority representations.
And may I just add that my mother had voted every year since she was legally able to. And it was so disheartening to her because she didn't think she was going to be able to vote because they didn't accept her birth certificate and wanted this new long form thing that they had started doing, and it was really a disturbing experience to have to go through. And these are the kinds of things that happen. If you're 90 or even 80 years old and you were born in the South, they didn't even keep records of your birth most of the time. It was lucky that they did have hers, but she had to show 2 types of birth certificates. And that's the kind of thing that's starting to happen all over again.
It is, Lynette. Thank you for sharing that story. That's powerful.
Wow. Here's another question from Bev Bachman that says, what would you suggest are ways that the League of Women Voters could help POC communities circumvent the restrictive laws until we can get better people voted into office? I don't know what POC means. I'm sorry, but hopefully somebody up there does.
People of color.
Thank you very much. Anyway, do you have some suggestions that we could put into place today, tomorrow, next week?
Yeah, I mean, you can't put people into office, people of color into office, unless you have a person willing to run. So find a person that would represent the values of the League of Women Voters and promote the heck out of them. Presumably it's somebody who's got connections a little bit already at the grassroots level. They've either they're involved in local grassroots politics, and that's important because politics is about money, and unless you're independently wealthy, you need somebody to help fund your candidacy, and so that's why it's important to find a candidate that shares your values, but also has a connection to one of the political parties in town that would sponsor this candidate and direct funds their way to help them run a good campaign. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is honestly, in a small way, to continue doing things like this, to invite speakers that might represent your values and promote the heck out of it so that people can listen to these Zoom talks or come in person if necessary, and change the world one vote at a time. I mean, that's really what this is about.
Thank you. We have a question that says, there are many professions who need to understand CRT and aren't getting that education. I guess what they're just hopeful of is that maybe you would comment on how to spread this to other professions that are dealing with people and children and values out there.
We've had the last couple of years, we've had a chilling effect, or at least critical race theory has had a chilling effect because it's been politicized. And as I mentioned earlier, most folks who oppose it don't even know what they oppose. And they take their talking points from right-wing radio, and they've created this fiction in their minds that this is what they're up in arms against. When in reality, most of what I've heard has not been correct. So a lot of businesses, some of these businesses started to implement CRT techniques, sensitivity training about how to engage in both among coworkers and also folks in the community with whom you do business, people of color. And they've hired sensitivity trainings, they've brought in CRT training specialists. But the problem is, since it's been politicized, they backed off. And the only way to bring it back and to continue to promote it would be to talk about it publicly where it's not a bad word. I mean, anytime you hear CRT in the news, it's just something to fear, right? I hope that what we talked about tonight, this is not a fear tactic. It's just simply a way to look at structural racism. But yet people don't want to talk about it because of the climate that we're in. Schools, which of course is where I come into play, it bothers me greatly to think that we politicize this. I suspect that if we were to go into my community here where I live in Pueblo West and talk to the school board, I suspect that the vast majority of them opposed CRT, but yet they don't really know what it is beyond something about racism or something, right? So we've got to educate people more about the tools that CRT allows us to bring to the table as we fight racism. And most people, by the way, who oppose it, I'm gonna give some folks the benefit of the doubt. They oppose racism. They don't want to live in a racist society, right? But the problem is that they don't recognize that we have to have tools in order to fight this sort of racist thought. And some folks who understand what racism is and structural racism, they're afraid of where it all might lead. That's another possibility, right? If laws protect white people at the expense of people of color, what does that mean, right? And some people are really fearful about that. And they don't want these conversations in our schools, which I think is tragic.
Ruth, do you see something that we might have missed here? Bev says, I'm wondering about restrictive voting laws. And how can the League of Women Voters help those targeted to circumvent the restrictive voting laws to allow those folks to vote? It's not a major issue here in Colorado, but it is in other states. And do you understand that further, Ruth? To explain that a little more?
Yeah. I think that some of the things that League is doing is just having a push on protecting the right to vote, supporting laws that protect the right to vote and opposing those that try to suppress the right to vote. I think that the last election, we actually promoted an app, a phone app, where people could report if they were harassed at the polls. And I know that I personally have been talking to the local NAACP president, Mrs. Mack, and we may be working together locally to see what we can do to protect people when they do go to the polls, and to try to take and advertise and help and advocate for those who feel like their rights have been violated.
Ruth, I've got a question, since you're part of the women voters. What's the percentage, do you know, in Pueblo County of mail-in votes versus walk-in votes?
I don't know that right off, I'm sorry.
Just because, yeah, I mean, I do mail-in, it's very handy, it's wonderful, I get it done. And then to drop it off, but I don't know how many people are actually going in person, especially with the pandemic. And how
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I was just wondering, because yeah, voting has made things so wonderful here, but I know down in the South, they are just ripping the shreds out of that.
Sure.
And you hear about politicians trying to promote the Black vote, but then the Southern states don't want it. I don't get it.
I understand that Colorado Springs has introduced a bill to stop the allowing the carrying of firearms within a certain amount of distance around polling places. I mean, I was so shocked. I couldn't believe that somebody'd be bringing a gun to a polling place, but apparently that happens, or they wouldn't have introduced this bill. And of course, there are people who are fighting that. But I guess right here in our own little state, we're talking about restrictive or trying to stop restriction on voting. But have you heard anything about that, Dr. Harris? Does that ring a bell?
No, it doesn't surprise me.
Really?
But no, yeah, this is going on across the country where they're dropping laws that prevent firearms within a certain footage of voting precincts. And obviously it's geared for one reason only, to intimidate people from voting.
Intimidate.
I'll tell you, my concern about Colorado is that we have a person who's running for Secretary of State, and I don't think she'll win. She's from the Western Slope, but she's under investigation for sharing. She's part of the voting apparatus on the Western Slope, and she's under investigation for sharing some voter data with somebody that's unauthorized. And I would worry about the wrong hands getting into positions where they have to certify the electoral count in states. And we're seeing this across the country, that if Coloradans or Arizonians or whomever, if they vote a certain way, but yet the state officials don't want to certify the vote and to send the electoral delegates from that particular candidate who won the popular vote, they don't want to certify it and pass it up the chain, that's a problem. And that's frankly where democracy dies, when you have a small group of people deciding which electors go to the state house that violates the will of the people. And if you look at what we're seeing in the news now, is that there were attempts to promote fraudulent electoral ballots or fraudulent electors. That is, that they were not the lawful electors that should have been counted. And fortunately, it worked. The system stopped it. It didn't happen. But the fact is that these fraudulent electors were in play. And it didn't work the first go around, but who's to say it won't work in 2024? This is obviously deeply concerning.
I guess. Oh my gosh.
More than likely, I don't want to be a doomsdayer, but another possibility that we see is not just what I mentioned, which is the states will not honor the right and lawful electoral delegates. The other one would be that you create such a confusion that you don't find a winner. And then, of course, according to the Constitution, it goes back to the House of Representatives and they cast ballots to choose. And if that's the case, the way that the House of Representatives is set up in the United States, it would favor one party over another. And so what you don't want is the House to choose your president. We, the people, should choose our president.
Right. Whoa, you have been so informative to all of us. Oh my goodness. Ruth, do you see other things that we should be asking here, or have we kind of covered the questions?
Just to comment that bill about firearms was just introduced this week into the state legislature. And I have heard rumors of someone in Pueblo, an African-American in Pueblo, feeling uncomfortable because when he went to turn his ballot in, there was someone there who had a gun on their hip. So yeah, it happens here. Probably, allegedly,
Mm-hmm.
That's a rumor I heard.
Well, thank you for sharing. Well, Professor Harris, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your wisdom and the fun slides and your time. Thank you so much for coming and helping us with this tonight. We are so appreciative. And we are so appreciative to our audience who came to hear Dr. Harris's wisdom. Thank you for joining us. This is indeed a complicated topic, and you have helped make it a little less complicated. It's pretty complicated still, but thank you so much for untangling as much of it as you have for us. We would like anybody to know that if you are interested in becoming a part of the League of Women Voters, please by all means go to our website. It's really simple, lwvpueblo.org, and come join us. We would welcome you with open arms. Finally, please check our website for future presentations like this. It is our duty to help inform the public, and we take it very seriously, and we would love to have you continue to join us. And Professor Harris, are there any last words of wisdom you would like to leave us with before we bid everyone farewell here?
I just say, speak out. We have an obligation to speak out in a civil way and educate people who are misinformed, and obviously try to do it with an empathetic voice, do it in a spirit of humility, but we have to speak out. If we don't speak out, then this is how democracy dies. So that's, it's just so important to educate ourselves and to speak out. And if we can do that, I think we'll make the world a little bit better.
Well, thank you for giving us some of the tools to do that. We are so appreciative.
Thank
Ruth,
you.
it's back to you.
Okay, well, I don't have anything else except, let me see, someone says, Lori B says, I moved here from Mississippi to Pueblo 4 years ago. I love voting in Colorado. I've seen the worst voter intimidation, support, and racism this country has to offer in Mississippi. I've waited 4 to 6 hours to vote. Polling places closed in the majority of Black areas. Please don't let Colorado go the way of Mississippi. Stay engaged. Thank you for that. And Bev Bachman says Australia is to list Hamas and US far-right groups as terrorists. So does the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Aha, okay. Here's thank you, another thank you, and another thank you. Thank you, everybody, for appreciating Dr. Harris's time and effort. Let's see, here's a long one. Let me see if I've missed anything. Oh, that's the one you just talked about, the Lori that moved from Mississippi. I think probably we're about done. Thank you, everybody who worked on this and for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Harris, so much.
Yes,
Thank you,
thanks.
everybody.
Thanks for
It's a
coming.
pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.